Night. It's a SYNKDLive in Atlanta.
Yes, and welcome to the Fireside Chat. Today we're going to be talking about some green infrastructure concepts and ideas.
My name is Dr. Paltseva. I'm a professor at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I specialize on urban soil science, and my research is on urban soil contamination and remediation.
And I'm Dr. Damon Abdi with the LSU Ag Center, and my specialty is in sustainable landscaping, especially with water management and utilizing space effectively.
Today we're going to talk about green infrastructure for landscapers.
So a little background on me. I got both of my degrees. First of my degrees in landscape management, landscape contracting, second one in horticulture, and I spent years working in the industry. So I've got a unique perspective of both the applied aspects of landscape horticulture, and then also with some insights from the research perspective as well.
And my background is in Earth and Environmental Sciences from City University of New York. I am also chair of the Urban Anthropogenic Soil Division at the Soil Society of America. I recently became an associate for the same journal, so exciting things are coming soon.
So we're excited to walk you through some research and some practices that you can use to influence your green infrastructure applications in your business. So starting off by defining green infrastructure, it's a term that we're all pretty familiar, at least have heard about. We might not be very comfortable defining it.
I would like to ask audience, what is green infrastructure for you?
Hopefully deliberate planning of green spaces.
That's a great answer. The deliberate planning of urban spaces using natural elements, using plant material, and using things that are sustainable and that are a departure from what we typically consider as gray infrastructure, where we think of steel and concrete, gutters, and sewer systems. So green infrastructure, of course, as the name implies, has that natural kind of feel to it.
It's basically mimicking natural system. And also another term for it, which is commonly used, is nature-based solutions.
So there's several examples of green infrastructure that you may probably have encountered. Things such as rain gardens, permeable pavement, trees, and of course maintaining a positive urban canopy. Talking about downspout disconnected from storm sewers.
It's also urban agriculture, something I'm passionate about. Urban gardens considered as a green infrastructure because they also provide multiple ecosystem services that are beneficial for people and the environment.
There's several benefits that come by implementing green infrastructure into the landscape, such as managing stormwater, especially where you're reducing or delaying some of the large outflows of water. It reduces some of that pressure on sewer systems, on drainage systems, so it starts to help to mitigate those concerns.
Well, one of the biggest benefits of green infrastructure, especially for huge cities, I think it's an urban heat island effect, because it really helps to mitigate the urban heat island effect, because green, plants, they evaporate water, they cool down the air, and it really helps to surface from overheating. And of course, it cleans the air against lots of pollutants, dust.
There's a lot of benefits with it, but also it helps to support biodiversity. It helps to create habitats to support birds and other critters that are creeping around the landscape. But not only that, it's also shown to have a positive impact on humans, especially their mental health and their physical well-being, having a healthy, natural area, particularly in areas that don't have it, such as our urban communities. And really, when we think about the urban environment, we got to take stock into what the primary features are of it. And what we think of mostly is rooftops and pavement. It accounts for about 2/3 to 3/4 of the urban areas, just impermeable surfaces, roofs, pavement, etc. And the effect on that environment, certainly when water can't infiltrate through the soils, that really exacerbates a lot of the issues. And there's many pollutants that can run off water, both pollutants that we can see, such as litter, but also some pollutants that we can't see. Anna talks a lot about pollutants in soils, so some common urban pollutants you see.
Well, there are multiple. There are heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Nowadays, we have a lot of plastic, microplastic, nanoplastic, forever chemicals. I specialize specifically on heavy metals like lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, copper, and zinc that are very common in urban environments. Very often they are co-contaminants, they coexist, and if you find a very high concentration of one of metals, you're likely to find other metals high concentrations as well. So really important to test urban soils when we establish green infrastructure in different forms and shapes. It's really important to establish that baseline to see what's the content of heavy metals.
That's where green infrastructure can really help to improve communities. So green infrastructure is unique. That encompasses both engineering for managing stormwater and creating more shade in nice areas and urban areas, but it's also artistic as well. So being able to implement these natural solutions in a way that creates a improved aesthetic to the environment is a great way to merge the two together. But also education is very important, and finding out new ways to advance green infrastructure is a critical role, and one that both of us are very happy to play in our positions.
Naples, but it's a trick question, because the point here is to show that urban soils limited in soil resources. It's limited in resources because we see this very typical pattern of centers and downtowns being very with buildings. There's no green space except like we go to more like areas and we see more greenery, which is very typical pattern for old cities where we have more concrete jungles inside than outside. We also find a lot of artifacts like from Italy, ancient ceramics, and now in museums, right? So we leave a lot of bricks, garbage, plastics, bottles, glass, slag. It all goes into the soil, and in urban environments we find it very diverse in high composition, concentrations, different compositions. So this is really interesting in what is urban soil from any other type of soil. We said about urban heat island effect before. So modified temperatures is a common feature that you find in urban soils because of, again, of the effect of the urban heat. And there's a lot of incinerators, car emissions. So it's the heat that traps inside of the city, and then it's of the soil. As we go to suburbs or outside, the temperatures will be lower. And we have a high heterogeneity. Because so diverse, we have different zones, commercial zones, residential zones, parks, industrial areas. Each of those zones will have different management practices, and this will be reflected in the soil properties that are developed over time.
Speaking of soils, from a landscape perspective, the more information you have to start is always a better thing. So to take some quick site soil assessments, some examples can include pulling out a soil profile or a soil core or a soil section such as this. And you can look at some of those visual indicators of the soil to get a better idea of what conditions might be there. For example, if you see clay soils but they have more of a gray mottled color, that indicates that there's a lack of oxygen in there. Versus you see it had more of that red clay. Of course, we're in Georgia, so they're known for that. You think of more oxidized clay with a higher oxygen percentage in there. Good to have a good idea of what kind of soil texture you deal with. About the soil texture triangle, talking about sand soil.
There are multiple classes of soil that we like to identify. There are 12 texture classes. They're based on a proportion of sand, silt, and clay. So it's really important to understand in your soil, if you build a garden or you decide to change your landscape, how much of sand, how much of clay, because this will determine how much water you need to add into your soil, and fertilizer amount, how often you add this. It's really important for maintaining your landscapes in the long run.
Really looking at things like drainage is one of the most important things, where you want to be cognizant of where that water is flowing, because having soils that do not drain effectively is just ripe for disease issues. And then on the other end of that, you want to check out how compacted your soils are. You got very compacted soils, the roots are not going to be able to penetrate and work their way through the system as effectively. You can use different specialized tools. We showed soil cores, we showed soil extractors, and then we've also got penetrometers, things like that can help measure how much pressure needs to be exerted by a root to be able to push through the soil.
So some common soil properties that are really important to investigate when you build a green infrastructure, among many, but this is like several. It's a water movement in soil, so infiltration, percolation, and permeability rates. Then it's a soil texture, we just discussed. It's a proportion of sand, silt, and clay. Density is related to compaction, because the soil should not be overly compacted, and density would be different between soil and sandy soil. Depth to bedrock, how much space plants actually have to develop their roots, and chemical properties like pH, cation exchange capacity, nutrients, organic matter content, and heavy metals. In this presentation, I'm not going too much into heavy metals. I will share the resources with you, how you can, if you find some. So soil testing is really important, and when you get your report, you find all these different parameters, then you need to address them. There is a book that is coming out in 2 months from now. It's called the Urban Soil Guide. It's going to be the best in the market because I wrote it.
There we go.
It's really the first guide that is developed for science students, but also amateur gardeners or nerds, as I like to say, because they who want to test the science of soil on their own. They can test properties without sending it to the lab.
Accessible way to get your hands dirty when you're working with soils and you want to get a little bit of background information.
What can you do to improve properties of the soil that you get? You feel free to take a screenshot of this table, but there are some parameters how we can address or improve our soil based on the values. Just give an examples. Organic matter, if it's less 1%, it's a problem. It needs to be at least like 5%. If you have more than 20%, it's not going to make much of a difference. So sometimes I see gardeners grow plants in the compost, grows first great, but then over time it creates imbalances. It's not advisable just to grow in the compost. It really needs to have some mineral soil as well. Percent of like percent, it's in parts per million, so 600, more than 1,000 parts per million. It can be very toxic for plants. So it's really important for some states where there's less precipitation, salts can build up and plants. Stability percolation rate will be like 0.25 inches per, or we should keep it close to neutral, slightly acidic. 6 to 7 would be ideal. Some nutrients have different preferences, but overall it's close to neutral level. At the same time, heavy metals are the least available when pH is close to neutral. So nature is smart, it has its balances, it keeps the harmony. So for most of these problems we can address, we add compost or organic matter. Very often peat is recommended, but it's not quite sustainable. So try to avoid peat and add mulch or compost, biochar, or some other organic waste that we can recycle. It improves infiltration of the soil, improves biodiversity of the soil, bacteria feed on it, it releases nutrients, and also can actually form organic mineral complexes with the metals, make them less toxic.
So it's kind of finding the right, just like Goldilocks, you're finding that exact kind of one in your soils and identifying that and addressing it necessarily.
So here's an example of strategies and deal with metals in particular, but also it's practices that improve organic in the soil. You can use yours to get an open access article if you want to have a full research on this. But the basic strategies is, again, adding organic matter in different forms. Maybe mulch, maybe compost, biochar, biosolids, also a very common amendment these days to form organic mineral complexes with the soil metals. Build garden far from traffic areas or industrial sites. Use drip irrigation, so it does not create runoff, and it also helps to keep splashes down. So if you don't want to grow, maybe you can keep it ornamental, so you can add inorganic mulch, maybe some gravel. We want to keep soil in place instead of it blown away. So it's really important to know what the spread of contaminants is in your property or site, and then try to cover it or remediate it. So you choose what you can do about it.
So in some of my work, one of my priorities is in really helping to establish an urban canopy as well as possible and really maximize our space, right? Because of course the benefits of an urban canopy is, down the area, makes places more enjoyable. But it all starts at the beginning, and a lot of trees suffer because at the start they're planted incorrectly, right? This image right here, this is a prime example of one of the biggest culprits in the industry, planting too deeply. Now, when you plant that root flare too deeply in the soil, you're effectively choking out those roots, and you're going to have a lot of health issues. So always make sure you're planting that root flare slightly above grade. I always kind of being a little bit too high. You can always add more soil. It's a lot harder to take away soil. But with that in mind, one of the research projects that we started last year was different plant establishment methods for one of the biggest concerns our contractors have, which are root-bound plants and containers. So root-bound plants and containers, everybody has a different way of prepping them. Does anybody in the crowd have a specific way that they address it? Okay, can you do that by hand? Okay, so we got hand manipulation using tools, a little mycorrhizal. Okay, we can change the root ball, we can change the environment it's growing in. So these were some of the concepts that informed the idea of this study, where we did pretty much exactly that. Our control was just to leave the root-bound plants. And we used a common method, just slicing it, scoring it with a box cutter, using a spade or using a shovel just to chop off the bottom where it's massed up there. And then, of course, really getting into it and teasing those roots out by hand. Now everybody has their way of doing it. To date, really, it's anecdotes that what we've seen people do. But what we really want to do is investigate these in a controlled environment setting in our landscape. So we compared these four metrics, these four methods of plant installation, and we put this in April of 2023, and we're letting them grow out for a couple seasons at the station. They're all looking great. Throughout the first year, they all grew very well, but 1 year is certainly not enough to make these claims. So what we're excited to do is continue monitoring growth through this year, seeing is there any dieback, particularly after the freeze we've had. And then in 2025, we're looking forward to digging those bad boys up and looking at those roots, seeing do root-bound plants, do they keep that root mass entrenched in that one area, or are we seeing visually that they're spreading out? So we're really going to get right into that and do some qualitative and quantitative assessments. So that's one of the projects that we've been doing over at the Hammond Station in LSU. But that's just doing it at first, right? We got to think about the long-term maintenance, right? You got to consider the growth of the future tree. In an urban setting, these are some images that I saw. I saw tree grates that were right around the trunk, and the trunk was growing into it. Now something's got to give, and we don't want to see any of the trees that have been surviving for several years have those issues. Similarly, we got to think about this from a community standpoint, where those trees are going to be growing into. You don't want those to be blocking signs. And we recently wrote a fun article for Ace of Base fans out there. I saw the sign that teases about pruning around that. Thank you. Got a little fun with it, right? Really keeping the theme about managing green areas in the landscape, right? When we see bare soil like that, what do you think when you see bare soil like that in an urban area?
For compaction, potential of topsoil because it can be blown away or washed away, especially with the severe rainfall. We see that a lot, erosion. So we really need to cover it.
So adding kind of coverage to these bare parts of the soils is another big area of research that we've been getting into. So it comes down to several important things. Compaction, we talked about the importance of having space for roots to be able to breathe, right? Compacted soils lose some of that pore space. Now, two ways that we can cover up that bare soil and keeping people from walking on it, hopefully, is using ground cover plants, low-growing plant material to cover up and spread over that area, and by using mulch. In both cases, we're removing the direct access that the sun and the wind has to that soil where it can erode, where it can wash out, all kinds of stuff, and we can help water infiltrate through there, and it looks better, right? At the end of the day, we're doing engineering and we're doing artwork in this. So we can get creative with it too. Here's an example of Asian jasmine with pine straw that are intermixed into an artistic design to cover up some space in an urban area. Right? Now, one of the barriers to ground cover plants, right? There's several popular plants that are used as those low-growing ground covers. But a lot of people balk at that because of the initial upfront cost versus, for example, grass seed where you're just throwing seed out over an area. When you're planting ground covers, you're oftentimes installing these in some sort of grid pattern, right? Now, the question we wanted to answer was, for different species, can we cut down how much investment we put in these plants and select plant material that rapidly spread? So effectively, what we did is we looked at several different ground covers, and in a single plot, we'd use ratios of 9 plants as our typical instant gratification look for getting plant material there, versus a reduced density plant, with the hopes that by cutting down plants from 9 to 5, we are going to be able to let those spread in and get the same effect, but with nearly half the initial upfront cost. So we did this research across about a dozen different ground covers, and it was pretty neat. On the top, we have the recommended density. On the bottom, we have that more reduced density. And what we saw is with certain plants, such as our annual ground covers, such as Evolvulus, which has nice little blue flowers, is that after 6 weeks of growth, they covered the same amount of area. So you've got that same effect for less cost fairly quickly. It's true for several of our annuals. So if you get it out of every year, if you're replanting this, you can cut your costs nearly 50% every year. That's a lot of savings. Compare this to some of our very popular perennial ground covers. Louisiana jasmine's a big one. But for those ones, we really saw that you need to put that upfront investment if you want that instant gratification. It's going to be a little bit slow to fill in. Now, depending on your budget, your site, and your client goals, that may be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's something to be cognizant of. Liriope is another plant, so we use Liriope, Scari Isabella, so that was more of a non-Liriope. It stays kind of spread out so much versus some other Liriope species. But that was another example where you got to put that initial investment up front. Other kind of ground covers, sweet potato, ornamental sweet potato, very vibrant colors, stick out. And what you might notice is that after 6 weeks, there's no difference. You're getting that same look with those annuals covered. But you see it drop off quite a bit. Why might that be, you ask? Winter's a good guess. We had a lot of deer in our area, so we are at a very rural research station. My lab over at LSU, and there the deer absolutely loved it. So the key takeaway from this is sweet potatoes grow fast whether you're planting them at more density or more space density, and regardless of density, deer love them. So be cognizant about what your environment are. If you're in an urban area, probably not the top concern you have. But if you're looking for something fast growing to cover a lot of space, think about it like that. Now, I'm not certainly advocating, I love turf, right? Turf has its place, but we also got to think about being sustainable with our time and effort and how much work we're putting into it. In certain areas like parking lot medians, turf grass like that, it's a very narrow strip. You're not going to drive a 40-inch, 48-inch mower over that. Your chances are weed eating over the top of that, right? It's very time intensive, gas intensive, you're fertilizing, you're doing all that. Instead, you can just use, oh, absolutely. You're dealing with all these challenges in this very narrow strip. And with green infrastructures, we want to make it as easy to implement. And by having ground covers there instead, you are cutting down the maintenance. You trim that liriope back once, twice a year, maybe. And you're cutting down the time. You also get the nice little purple flowers. So you're getting a nice little mix just by having that. And certainly in large areas, right? We talk about compacted soils in urban areas. We've got a whole bunch of Asian jasmine here in downtown New Orleans, and this is right around a live oak. These historic trees in our urban areas, we don't want people walking over it. What happens when people just keep walking over that soil?
Compaction, and wet drainage.
Exactly, right? And then eventually what happens? We start seeing those roots come up from the ground. Now, that's clearly a sign of the tree in stress, but also it's a tripping hazard. And you don't want to have somebody encumbered by that. We've all been in urban environments where we're walking on the sidewalk and we see panels of that sidewalk lifting up, right? So taking care of these tight spaces is important. By having ground covers there, you're not inviting people to walk all over that area. They're not going to keep stomping around near the roots. It's an artistic way of guiding people to where you want them, particularly even around new trees or electric boxes that you don't want people fooling around with for whatever reason they may have. Now, that's not to say turf doesn't have a place. Turf absolutely does have a place. We're not playing football on a bed of liriope here, right? So we need that. What turf does is it really is more inviting, such as this same image from that we've seen in the last live oaks and stuff. We've got open turf spaces that invite people to put out a blanket, sit down, enjoy that area. It's welcoming. And turf definitely has a place for that. So rather than getting into a narrative of ground covers versus turf, it's ground covers and turf. It just depends on the right situation. Sustainable for the planet, sustainable for the maintenance, and sustainable for the long-term goals of the landscape, right? And we can get creative with a bunch of other things, such as using liriopes or other grass-like ground covers. Granted, they're not grasses, they're in the lily family, of course. But they have that appearance that looks like a more coarse turf grass. Having liriope changes the look of it in that different way and cutting down the maintenance. You can integrate that with also more coarse stone to slow people down, and it subconsciously changes the human aspect of the landscape, right? And both of us, we both contribute a lot to Synked. Synked's great for getting some of the creative insights that we can put into the landscape. Right, several of my articles in this include irrigating the urban landscape, thinking about water management and that feature. Thinking about the diverse landscape. we're all around for it, but Dutch elm trees used to line many great American cities until what happened? Dutch elm disease, right? And the sad part of that is you had all these historic trees with that graceful architecture that just adorned our streets. But then when disease came, that monoculture was wiped out, right? So having a nice variety of plants can help protect against any of those issues. The article I put was about using boxwood alternatives. If you're boxwood dieback, boxwood blight, things like that, huge issue in the Gulf South. So some other plants that can be used in similar fashion include Yohan hollies, include Podocarpus, Japanese yew. So you can use certain evergreen plants that you can create more formalized hedges with that in case disease comes, you're not all out of luck with your boxwoods. You got some other things. So right plant, right place, the more options we have, the better. Certainly thinking about supporting sustainable landscapes for pollinators and things like that. So over work at the Hammond Research Station with LSU, we've got a bunch of trial gardens there. We've got about 100 acres of space there, and we've got dedicated evaluations of plant materials under different conditions. And if they can make it in Hammond, they can make it in the Gulf South. We're very comfortable saying that.
Make it anyway.
And so we have a lot of plants right there. If you're ever interested in checking it out, come on by, reach out to me, and I'd be happy to host y'all. And then you can also check out our online tools that have yearly synopsis of what kind of plants we got going on there.
So some takeaway message that soils aim to be tested for green infrastructure establishment. It's important to maintain plant cover, ground cover, and irrigate the proper ways, as Damon was talking about. We offer our services at our prospective universities. If anyone can want to test their soils for heavy metals, organic matter, soil texture, salt, pH, you can send it to the Delta Urban Soils Lab at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And if you have any questions related to horticulture and best practices for management of soils in urban and non-urban environment, Damon is a great expert.
I try to be.
If you would like to learn more about urban soils, I have an archive of different lectures. Some world-recognized experts give guest lectures to my classes, so they are posted on YouTube, so you can screen the QR code, and feel free to follow me on Instagram and to learn more about urban soils spiced in fashion.
If you connect with me, there's many ways to, but I'm always happy to help people have a greener environment out there. I'm all about that. So reach out to either of us. If you look at some of our content, stay connected with us, and we'd be happy to take any questions that you may have on green infrastructure.